Hello, heathens. So I am super excited because today I have Jeremy McNabb with me, who is a friend that I met on the old Bird app over Twitter. I say friends. I don't know if he considers me a friend. I consider him a friend. And when I first found him, I was fascinated because he was writing his master's thesis, and the topic was the emergence of Christian witchcraft. So if you know anything about me or the people that I surround myself with, then you know I immediately jumped on this and I was like, let me talk to you. Let me interview you immediately. Small demands. And Jeremy was in the middle of writing this thesis, we had to put it off a bit, which is totally fair, but he just recently defended it successfully. And I am super excited to get to talk to him about his research today. But before we do that, I want to give him an opportunity to introduce himself, tell us a little bit about his story, and the path that led him to study this. So, Jeremy, if you don't mind, tell us about yourself.
Thank you. So my name is Jeremy McNabb. I just finished my master's in theological anthropology at Eastern University, so as part of the requirements for graduating, I had to write a master's thesis, and this topic was the emergence of Christian witchcraft. And so basically, in my early 20s, I was still heavily involved in mainstream Christianity, working with parachurch ministries, and was living in Dover, Delaware. And they have a City of Dover Pagan Pride Festival every year. And during one of the interviews in the newspaper, they had a woman that said she was participating as a Christian Wiccan. And at the time, being in a mainstream Christian group, I thought that's not a thing
Blasphemy.
that exists. Exactly. Yeah, it was terrible. And I was intrigued, but I was like, this is a little too far for me. So years later, maybe 10 years later, as I'm going through my own process of reevaluating everything I believe on LGBTQ rights and original sin and religious pluralism, I really began to wonder if I hadn't judged her too quickly. And so I asked myself, could a Christian witch truly exist? And so at the beginning of 2019, before I enrolled in Eastern, I inadvertently stumbled into a Facebook group that claimed to be an online meeting place for Christian witches. And I thought that was kind of interesting. So I just on a whim requested to join a bunch of the ones I found. And as I began reading through some of the stuff I was seeing, I thought there's some coherence here that I didn't expect. And I wondered, in the process of rethinking my own beliefs, had I completely bypassed a surprisingly wide and seemingly viable revolution in theology and doctrine. So I chose this topic for my master's thesis. Wasn't sure quite what to expect because it was a fringe movement. It's the internet. I was worried that the demographic I had chosen would just turn out to be a bunch of miscellaneous people who were had no rhyme or reason to what they believe. But the longer I hung around, the more I realized that there's not just one group, but there's actually a broad spectrum of theological development oriented around deconstruction and decolonization. So on one end, I found a group of Christians that were they had deconstructed far enough to embrace LGBTQ rights and feminist movements, but they still carried a lot of the anxiety-based religious fear and guilt. And then on the other end, you had people who had realized the negative effects of evangelicalism and fundamentalism, and that it had on their faith and on their mental health and on their relationships with other people. And so they were working to understand how ancestral religions and the religions that existed in the communities around them could also be viewed by Christians as having as bearing the image of God. So what I found was, in this process, people rediscovering God through rituals, practices, and beliefs that were foreign to mainstream Christianity. And one of the interesting things I found, because I'm still a Christian, one of the things I found interesting was that where you have people who are deconstructing and embracing a lot of these heterodox beliefs, they're oftentimes doing so from an ethical standpoint and from a consensual standpoint. So you have on one hand ethical and consent honoring, heterodox and heretics. And then on the other hand, you have, Orthodox people who are morally corrupt, and one is almost shaming the other back in line. So that was there's a gentleman named Michael Welker, who's an anthropologist in Germany, and he talked about historically how this is actually something that you see across 2,000 years over and over again. So anyway, I hope I kind of summarized everything clear enough.
If you don't mind me asking, what denomination, or did you grow up Christian? And if you did, what denomination was it?
So I grew up Wesleyan. I was Wesleyan until I was in a Wesleyan church, worked at youth camps, went to a Wesleyan high school, and worked as a Wesleyan youth pastor until 2014. Okay. So from 1980 to 2014.
For folks that might not be familiar with the sort of what makes Wesleyan, could you do like a 60-second elevator pitch?
Sure. So Wesleyans believe in what's called progressive sanctification, which is you can continually become more and more surrendered to Christ in order to eliminate more and more sin from your life, with the end goal of sometime before you die or at the point of death, eliminating all sinful motives from your life. And most people don't believe that they get to that point, but they do believe that there are a few who make it, and those are, that's the goal. And they are Arminian, so the opposite of Calvinist. They are the first denomination to ordain women in the United States. Wow, okay. So women could preach in that denomination before they could vote. So it was progressive enough, but then somewhere around like the 1900s, they just kind of, it's far enough, and they stopped.
No need to go any further. Thank you. I've done enough.
Right. Yeah. No queer rights. No anything else. So
yeah, it's so strange to me how that's always the stopping point, or it seems to be so often the stopping point. Like, well, all of this is fine, but this one issue, nope, too far. Yeah. So would you consider yourself, you said you're still a Christian, do you consider yourself sort of aligned with any specific denomination now, or are you someone who is more just like, I follow Jesus and that's kind of it?
So technically my membership is with the Disciples of Christ, which is a sister denomination to the United Churches of Christ. I was a youth pastor in that denomination for about 6 months before I had to move across country. But yeah, I'm there's not one of those churches around here. We don't really attend at the moment. But part of it's COVID, part of it's just the types of churches that happen to be around. So
right, no, fair enough. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think most of my listeners would understand a little better. Well, maybe not understand a little better, but like as far as I'm concerned, when I met you on Twitter and was talking to you, I just sort of assigned the term progressive Christian to you. And for me, that's just somebody who is inclusive and affirming and, not a dick.
And that's fair. I have no issue with that. I might add mystical in there a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, so when I met my current partner, we were just friends for several years. And at that point in my life, I started to realize that I had been by, my life. And I would make comments and feel like that's not a thing a straight person says. So, that was I was like, what are you talking about? And
what do you mean?
It was just being raised in a free will church. It was just no, I only date women, so I'm straight. And she's like, but that's not how that works. That's not what you're saying. Yeah, that's not how that works. So.
That works. Yeah, but, you might only date women, but that's not what you're saying.
Yeah,
yeah. No, that's fair enough. And I know several people who have grown up really in very strict denominations and less strict denominations. Lord, I can't talk. And realized way later in life, like, oh, my sexuality actually isn't what I thought it was. I just was told it was one thing and it had to be one thing. And so I sort of never let myself even explore that it could be something else. And that's actually something So I don't know if you would consider any part of your journey deconstruction or not.
Oh yeah.
But for a lot of people, when, especially with this pandemic, when people couldn't really go to church and they got to spend time sort of at more, well, got to spend more time. They had to spend more time at home. I think it gave people a lot more space to sort of critically examine these ideas and beliefs and theologies that they had held so dear. And honestly, that's the only reason I ever got popular at all on the internet, was because we were going through, so bizarre, we're going through this huge like exodus of people from the church. And it just so happened that I did it 10 years ago. And so when people are now sort of like, what is this? What's happening? What's going on? What are the answers? Not that I have all the answers by any stretch, but, you know, biblical knowledge or scholarship and all of that. It was just sort of a happy accident that I found this community. But I have been really interested to see so many people see their sexualities. I don't want to say they evolved, because I think they've obviously always been that way, but they're just recognizing it and embracing it more now.
I will say that in all of the interviews I did, every single one, 100%, the deconstruction began either because they realized that they were queer in some way, or they got frustrated with church's racial equality stances. But those two issues came back every single time. It was one or the other.
Right.
So
I guess maybe we can start off there. So you found these Facebook groups and you entered into them. And in looking at your thesis, it seemed like at first folks were not incredibly open to being interviewed or talking about their sort of belief systems. And I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit about that, the reasons that they weren't interested in being interviewed.
Sure. So I found several different groups, and there's actually 3 different mindsets that these groups will have, one of the 3. And when I felt like I got as far as I could in just passive observation in these groups, I began to email the admins and ask. I said, "Can I post a link to this master's thesis group that I've put together?" And some of them said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead, but don't expect many people to show up." And I think I sent out the invitation to a total of more than 1,000 groups that numbered more than 1,000 people total. So about 1,000 people were exposed to the invitation. I had 12 join, and one I had to kick out because she was actually a mole. But yeah, it was incredibly surprising to me to find that a lot of these Christian witches, they are attending normal churches, like mainstream churches, and they keep their practice to themselves. A lot of stuff online. I joked about how, I really joked about, but I mentioned that like you might run into somebody who's like in a Pentecostal church or Assemblies of God and know a lot of like herbal remedies and stuff that they learned from their grandmother that they wouldn't dare mention to the people in the church. But then they're out here over on a pagan website sharing their herbal remedies with other people that appreciate them and believe in them. So yeah, a lot of those, they don't want to talk about it. Even in my own experience, I actually applied for a job in a church while I was writing this master's thesis, and interview went great. Second, third interview went great. I drove out to meet them, hit it off with the pastor, hit it off with the teens of the church, some of the other leadership, and we got to talk, and they're, "Oh, you're attending Eastern, what's your master's thesis on?" And I told them. And we spent the rest of the evening talking about, why was I not witnessing to these witches, and was I really sure they were Christian? And so it would not have been a good fit for me to end up in that church, I found out. But it very quickly the next morning I had an email saying that they had moved on to a different candidate. So
can't imagine why.
I understand why people don't talk about this when even the subject matter itself, it lends itself to disadvantaging.
Yeah, no kidding. I think it's really interesting, and I've talked a little bit about this before. Christians, obviously, by and large, are so diametrically opposed to anything that even smells like witchcraft, right? Like even a hint of it. Right. But they're also so incredibly blind to how many parts of their own religion are witchcraft, effectively, right? Like we have, I mean, what are prayers if not incantations and spells, right? Things that we repeat out loud together in a group or privately, either way. I mean, if you look at Catholic churches, we have all kinds of things going on there that would resemble witchcraft. I mean, the apex of Christianity is a blood sacrifice, right? There's like a little bit of necromancy on the other side of that. Like,
and it's really funny because when I wrote this paper, I said I had to draw lines on who was a Christian witch and who wasn't. So I just ended up going with the people who I self-identify as Christian witch, because you might have someone who's Baptist who considers themselves a Christian witch because they're praying to saints. But then you have a Catholic who prays to saints and they're like, I'm just a good Catholic. Right. And like even my own grandmother, like she would have like fainted for you to have said anything about witchcraft, but some of the superstitions that she taught me of the watermen growing up around the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay area, like like this is just witchcraft that we're not calling that. There's an anthropologist named Mary Douglas who wrote that there's no such thing as dirt. Dirt is when you have something that's not where it's supposed to be. And I talked about in my thesis where it was raining the day that I went to that job interview, and I accidentally tracked dirt into the church on my shoe, and they were like, no problem, we'll just dispatch it with a vacuum cleaner or broom, whatever. And I was like, in the paper I draw this connection. I'm like, I actually tracked two kinds of dirt in there that day. I tracked the dirt on my shoe, but I also tracked theological dirt because I brought in something into their church that was not supposed to be there, and they had no way to deal with it other than to get it as far away from their church and their teens and everybody else as far as possible.
I think it's really interesting. I was speaking with a scholar the other day, and we were talking about how so many people have taken Christianity and out of fear that their hierarchy is going to be disturbed or their power is going to be disturbed, they've decided that they have to kind of buckle down and say the Bible is inerrant, it's infallible, it's all of these things that make it incredibly rigid. The problem is, in making it incredibly rigid, they also make it incredibly fragile and incredibly brittle. And so, like you just said, when you come in with something and say, like, okay, I'm not saying you have to adopt this or agree with me, but we can discuss it. They don't have vocabulary, they don't have language, they don't have the brain bandwidth to engage in that way, because to even engage and say, yeah, that could be right, or like, let's talk about how you think that works. It threatens that inerrancy, that infallibility, and they don't have space for it, right? They can only get, if they let something push too hard, it's going to just break because it doesn't have the space to grow. It can't expand. If you try to let something else in, there's no space. It just breaks. And so I think it's actually quite sad, because Christianity could be so much more vibrant and diverse and, quite frankly, interesting and inclusive and all of these things. And instead it's become this sort of brittle stick in the mud that people are sort of running away from at record speed. But
there's an anthropologist. I'm sorry, not anthropologist. I think he's a historian, but his name's Alan Strathern, and he talks about the difference between transcendent religion and immanent religion, or immanentist religion. And so you have Christianity, which is a transcendent religion. We've codified our beliefs into a text, or even a belief about a text, because some of the things we believe aren't in the Bible, but we attribute them to the Bible. Yeah. Or you have immanentist, which shows up in more like paganism and like Native American spirituality. And he talks about how in some of these tribes, if you have a god of that town or of that community, and that town goes through a blight or a drought, they take the idol down, they take it out, they burn it, they throw it away, or they do something with it. And that's just how it works. And they bring in a different community's idol, put that up in instead. And deconstruction has been taking a transcendent religion and kind of doing that to it, saying, okay, we can now accept that this particular aspect that we've always believed is no longer valid or true, and kind of just get rid of it. And I think that's scary because, or not, it's not scary for me, but it becomes scary for other people because then they don't know where to stop with that.
Yeah. Well, and also most people that it's scary for, I would think, even if they're not the ones in the position of power in their church or denomination or whatever, largely, if you are a Christian, I don't want to say that. There are many Christians who are not white, but usually the Christians that are most concerned with preserving very specific theologies in a very specific way of doing things without bending or breaking, and are loudest about it, are usually the ones that are feeling that their power is being threatened. The hierarchy is being threatened, right? Like, if you want to take this away, I might not be on top anymore. And they're not going to say that, but that's exactly what's going on, right?
That's yeah. I mean, that's just maintaining the status quo in the Western world. Right,
of course. Love it. So what in your research did you find was driving this sort of, I don't want to say, I don't know if explosive is the right word, but it does seem that there was sort of a large, quick growth of Christian witchcraft.
I think there's a lot of different things going on. You have the abuses are being made known, so that's one thing. You also have COVID-19, like you said. People are kind of trapped at home. Social media, stuff's becoming more easy to get a hold of. But even the popularization of fantasy, Harry Potter and supernatural and that kind of thing, it's not that people are believing in fiction, but they've now found a socially acceptable way to explore what they believe through the avenue of fiction. And then one other thing I found was interesting, and none of the people who stayed Christians mention this, but a lot of the people who left Christianity mention this, the prevalence of healing oils, like Young Living and stuff, like the multi-level marketing where they sell all the different oils. A lot of the people that left Christianity mentioned that, and a lot of the people who stayed didn't mention it at all. So I think just the acceptability of even like homeopathic stuff has kind of even had an effect. So there's a lot of things going on, but those are the most common that I ran into.
I was thinking when I was reading some of this in your papers, if I grew up evangelical, technically non-denominational, but my parents were very strict about things, right? Like everything was demonic, everything was evil. And so things that like teenagers did when they were younger, like, things like tarot cards or watching Harry Potter or like a Ouija board at a party. Those things were all demonic, stay far away from them. I couldn't touch them with a 10-foot stolen pole, or a demon might attach himself to me. I mean, my parents went so far, I don't know if you'd be familiar with this show. It was on PBS when I was growing up, called Dragon Tales. And demonic. Couldn't watch it because they rubbed a dragon scale and went to a land with dragons. So demons. Pokemon, demonic. Like, everything.
We didn't. I wasn't raised with so much of that. My parents. I think part of it is that the Wesleyan Church is not a charismatic denomination, so sense. A lot of that doesn't make its way in. But definitely He-Man was not allowed. And Dungeons and Dragons, the TV show, was not allowed. So those things were not allowed. But some of the other things that I've heard other people tell me that they weren't allowed to do, I was like, I didn't even think of that. But
I mean, Lord of the Rings was A-okay. Chronicles of Narnia also okay. But that's because they could draw this like parallel to Jesus, That's what my mom would always say, like, well, it's an allegory. I'm like, no, Mom, I just think that you think Viggo Mortensen is hot. And like, okay, fair. But also like, that doesn't make it an allegory. But something that I noticed is when I deconstructed, or before I deconstructed this upbringing, I was scared of everything, right? Scared that like, if I had any interest in literally anything that wasn't just the Bible and God,
pre-approved,
exactly, the pre-approved stuff, then maybe I'm going to go to hell. Maybe I am going to invite a demon in. And even after I left and started really, getting rid of those more supernatural beliefs, I had a real interest in just exploring all of these things because I wasn't allowed to. And so as an adult who didn't have these fears of like having a demon, enter my body, I became very interested and fascinated with like things like astrology and just tarot cards and all these different things. And not because I necessarily believe that they have any actual power or that they're actually true, or that they're going to tell me anything about anything, but just because I finally could. I was finally allowed to explore things and read things and be interested in things without having to be this supernatural battle for my soul. Right? And so I think people always find it a little surprising when like I have probably 5 decks of tarot cards like on a shelf somewhere. I don't really use them. I just thought they looked really cool and I was interested in it. So I bought them because I could. And I think, and I obviously this is all speculation on my part, but I would be unsurprised if many people that sort of deconstructed, even if they didn't ultimately leave Christianity, just by nature of being allowed to explore things, sort of fell into this Christian witchcraft because they're finally allowed to do things and they find this all very interesting and they find these practices very interesting, but I don't want to leave Christianity. But like you said, I can dump some of this stuff that isn't working, and embrace the things that I enjoy and that I think work for whatever reason, homeopathic recipes or remedies, tarot cards, astrology, whatever.
I definitely think that's a very common pathway that people follow. Yeah.
I always lost my next question there. I'm going to have to edit this out. Sorry. My brain just went off the rails. Oh, I remember what I wanted to ask. So in the paper, and I'm sorry, I keep calling it that, in your thesis.
It's okay.
I just feel like I'm like in your paper and it's like an essay you turned in for like sophomore year. Very long paper. In the thesis, you mention a lot about folks, some folks anyway, both decolonizing and deconstructing their faith, and other folks that sort of don't decolonize it and just deconstruct to a certain point. And I think that most of my audience is fairly familiar with the deconstruction process. And I don't expect you to lay out what decolonization looks like, right? That's a very complicated topic. But in your experience, in your interviews, and your research, what did that look like when people decolonized their belief system or Christianity?
Sure. So when people begin decolonizing, they recognize, a lot of them just recognize that a lot of what Christianity is right now is built to uphold whiteness, and so that's a major concern. But some of it is also that a lot of people believe that the other cultures should be treated as though they're manifesting the image of God. And I think it's very important to put it that way, because if you say that other people are created in the image of God, what a lot of mainstream Christians hear is all the good stuff in your religion is because our God put it there. Or they hear that, your God, whether it's Odin, Allah, whoever, is actually our God in disguise and you just don't know it yet. And that's really, really problematic. So when you have a lot of people that are decolonizing, what they begin to say is we should treat them as though their beliefs are created in the image of God. And it becomes a way of honoring those beliefs as a good thing. So, when you have someone who came from maybe African tribal traditions or Native American spirituality or something else, and they start looking back at their ancestors and they say, you know what, those people lack nothing that I have as a Christian, and maybe I can even glorify God and re-embrace some of those things without it being an insult, because I believe he made them too, and there's a reason those beliefs are there. So that's probably a very poor explanation of it. But it basically says, it's basically the idea that other cultures manifest. It's the belief that as Christians we can accept that other cultures are manifesting the image of God as a community in their beliefs, in their culture, in their religion, even, and that a lot of them have come to the conclusion, and I think there's a theological warrant for this, and I actually worked out the defense of it in the paper, but that the biblical condemnations of paganism are actually biblical condemnations of imperialism that happen to be veneered by paganism. So the issue isn't that the guy next to Paul was worshiping Diana. The issue is that the guy next to Paul was working in a state church that was oppressing people and enslaving people, and it just happened to be veneered with Diana. And so Diana's not actually the bad guy. Rome is the bad guy, and they're just guarding themselves with Diana. So that
doesn't sound familiar at all. Yeah, maybe Jesus isn't the bad guy. Maybe America is the bad guy, and the bad place. Something that I thought was really interesting. I was speaking with Mark Lucher the other day. He's a Hebrew Bible scholar, and he was talking about how in very, very early Israelite history, there was a belief that if you died, your sort of ticket to a good afterlife would be how your family honored you, how they involved you in their existing traditions, right? So when they have celebrations, do they set a place for you at the table, right? Sounds like a dumb supper to me, but hey, what do I know? Did they set a place for you at the table during these celebrations? Did they keep your memory alive? And oftentimes what they would do is have idols, effectively, or images to represent those that had passed, and they would keep them in the house, and that would be a sort of a part of their religion. It would be a part of their, spirituality, at least, maybe not religion. I mean, I think most people at this point know that very early Israelites believed in a pantheon of gods. And you can see this in a number of places, one of which being Deuteronomy 32, where they talk about the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim. It's like the Song of Moses. And anyway, I won't get too far into that. But where basically the nations are portioned out by, is it El or Adonai? I can't remember who's sitting at the apex of the pantheon. I think it might have been El.
I think Michael Heiser says it's El. I'm not entirely sure.
That sounds right. You totally know. There's a reason I'm saying all of this. I think what struck me when I was reading your thesis was talking about how people were re-embracing this sort of ancestral worship. And I know that so many Christians, and I would have too when I was a Christian, would be deeply offended by this, right? Just absolutely horrified. No way, no how. Especially because, I mean, they all think that, at least my sect of Christianity, effectively thought that Catholics were all idol-worshipping pagans, effectively, who are going to hell straight away. And I think it's very interesting because obviously Christianity had co-opted Judaism, and they have absolutely no concept that the early Israelites effectively engaged in this kind of ancestral cult. And also that, and I know that Christians will say, yeah, we know, the early Israelites were polytheistic, but I actually don't think that they know in the way that they think that they know, right? So they're yeah, we know that they were polytheistic, but, they
were polytheistic when they were being bad.
Exactly, right? And that's why they were being punished.
Don't quote me. I'm not saying that. That was a.
I know. I made the mistake once of posting that on Twitter. Not what you just said, but saying do Christians really realize that the early Israelites were polytheistic? And that was everyone's response. Yeah, that's why they were always being punished. And I'm no, okay, so that's an incredibly Christian nonsense reading.
Yeah.
Just know. They weren't polytheistic because they were evil sinners. They were polytheistic because they were polytheistic. There was a pantheon, right? There was Asherah, there's El, there's Adonai, and eventually, they come together in a kind of sketchy way that we're not 100% clear on, but you can read Ted Lewis's book if you want to know more.
Okay.
If you have the time, not you, sorry, like everybody. It's like 700 pages long.
It's interesting.
No, it's really interesting. And sorry, I'm kind of derailing this conversation, but I just found it really interesting that like so many people are re-embracing this, like so many Christians that are becoming Christian witches are embracing this ancestral worship, or at least honoring. And
Right.
I think often, and I could be wrong on this, but part of that is them looking at other cultures and other religions and seeing that they have this very strong ancestral cult still going in their life, in their day-to-day, in their culture. And embracing it partially because of that, right? Without realizing that, like, actually the religion that you were or are a part of, and that you kind of co-opted, it did co-opt Judaism. So I hesitate to say Christianity is founded on Judaism, because I think that indicates that Christians do anything like Jews.
Yeah, I mean, it came out of it, but to back up and try and re-embrace stuff that wasn't a part of the Judaism at the time, like embracing stuff that came 200 years later, or even embracing, I don't know, it's very problematic.
Yeah. And so anyway, that was a very long-winded way of saying that, like, maybe Christians should just learn a little more about Jewish history. But anyway, I just found it interesting, because it seems like they're very much looking to these other cultures and other people, and that's great and fine. But also, if you just go far enough back and sort of, I don't want to say it's your own tradition, because it's not quite that. But yeah, I mean, if you go far enough back, it's there too, right? This is sort of a universal thing for a very long time.
And there's a preacher named Livon Briggs, wonderful woman. She's on Instagram and Facebook, and she talks a lot about, honoring her ancestors. And she was I don't remember what denomination she was. She was a preacher, and she's still a preacher and still a Christian, but she talks a great deal about honoring her ancestors, and it's been absolutely fascinating to follow her, and it's been really encouraging. So
yeah. What would you say was the most surprising thing that you sort of dug up or discovered in your research?
One was the idea that the biblical condemnations of witchcraft and paganism may have actually been condemnations of imperialism. But in the process of my own deconstruction, I went through a liberal phase, and it goes back to like the universal Christ, and Jesus is in all these religions, or the Christian God is all these other gods, and having to reckon with that not being the case, and that not overwriting those other religions in order to then make them okay, I think was one of the biggest things I had to wrestle with. But also the degree to which, Christianity has tried to supersede Judaism, to become the completion of Judaism, and a lot of liberal folks now are also trying to make Christianity be the fulfillment of other pagan religions. So we're going through like a second wave of supersessionism that we're having to deal with in real time. That I feel like a lot of people are handling it well and very vocally. Because they're already aware of it. But the fact that it should have been predictable, and it wasn't. It wasn't predicted. So I think that was one of them. Other than that, there wasn't a whole lot. Once I got past those couple points, there wasn't a whole lot that's just really surprising. Other than to try and figure out, in some of my more mystical beliefs, why am I not a witch? And it's like, why am I not? Like, why is this person one and I'm not? Why? And it was very uncomfortable to try, and not that there's anything wrong with being that, but it's not something I've ever called myself or been.
Right.
And so it's one of those things that's like, these lines are so blurry that unless you're just calling yourself one, there's a lot of room for going one way or the other. So
yeah. So if you were to tell someone, and I know this is like not an easy question to answer, but if you met someone and they did, say, these 5 things, and you said, "Oh, that sounds like they're a witch," what would those
Mhm.
sort of, they don't have to be 5, but what would those kind of
Okay, so if
characteristics
they're,
be?
um,
Because I think we hear the
I
term
would
witch a
say,
lot, and people really, unless you've studied it, you have no actual idea what that means.
I would say the couple most common things, setting up an altar in your own house for your own purposes, and by altar I don't mean a place of conversion like we use in mainstream
Right.
Christianity, but a place where you do your spiritual work. So that's one thing. Usually there is at least some kind of spell casting. And that can be a lot of different things. That can be, lighting candles with intentions. It can be very organized money spells. And so that's another. I actually, I, in my career, like full time, I work as a tile installer and in new homes. And I walked into a house and there was this lady. She had gone and written Bible verses in the entryways of all the different doors. And I kind of just Googled real quick which ones, because some of them were just, I know my Bible pretty well, but some of them were just so
Yeah.
obscure that I'm like, I have no idea what this is. So I Google it, and it was just different stuff all through her house. And I finally ran into her and said, okay, I've got to ask. I'm doing a master's thesis on Christian witchcraft. I see you writing Bible verses all over the floor before the carpet and the tile goes in. I was like, what's prompting you to do that? And she's like, oh, I don't know. It just seemed like a good thing to do. And I'm just like, not off the internet anywhere. She's like, no, just. And so it's really hard to draw a line, because I would have 75% said, oh, this person's probably a practicing Christian witch and just not admitting it. And I genuinely think she had no concept of the similarities of what she was doing to other things. Maybe use of sigils. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of a common thing. Just going through, I'm trying to go through my ethnography of the different things that people did. I would say probably those 3 things are the primary ones, and then just doing the theological or mental work to try and sort out what that means for you. Like, if you are, nobody just one day wakes up and goes, you know what, I'm a witch now.
Right.
If you were in any kind of mainstream Christianity, you wrestle through that to a great degree. I mean, and so I think there's probably some long-standing internal theological argumentation in your own head about what you're doing, that if you're validating it, if you're finding that it fulfills something. I think that's probably the other thing. So
In your thesis, you write about 3 categories
yes.
of witches, which I found really interesting, and I think we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier.
Mhm.
But I was hoping you might sort of expound on those 3 types a little bit.
Sure. So I call it the LAA, which is the Liberation to Adventist axis. And what that means is that you have on one end Adventist Christian witches, and on the other end you have liberation-minded Christian witches. And I use the term Adventist because that's the term that came up the most. Some of them called themselves Bible Christian witches, was kind of that was a one thing that I heard used. But for the most part, I mean, into the thousands of people, the groups of 1,000 people probably use the term Adventist,
Interesting.
and those are people that have accepted the use of tarot as a form of prophecy, or they call God mother or goddess, and they have acknowledged that God's not a dude. And so you have that, but that's pretty much where it stops. They don't allow for any kind of other gods. They don't allow for saints, angels, anything like that. And even their tarot is, you say a prayer first for
Yeah, interesting.
protection, and you use it as a form of prophecy that's given by the Holy Spirit. So that's on the right
Okay.
side of the spectrum. In the middle, you have liberal, which is kind of a miscellany, but the thing that they all have in common is whatever they do, whether they get it right or get it wrong, God's grace is big enough to cover them. And I'm trying not to say that to sound like I'm condemning them, or to sound like I'm being condescending, because I really don't mean it that way. It's just that they have a very strong faith in God's grace, and they do what they want whatever they felt led to do as part of this practice. And that's just how it is. I mean, that's fine. And then but with that, you also have a lot of cultural appropriation that happens. You'll have a lot of people working outside of their own traditions that's questionable. And then on the liberation end, you have a much more constructed belief about the role that other cultures play in being human. And so a lot of these people are, again, re-embracing those, and they are much more careful about cultural appropriation. They're much more careful about staying in their own lane. And so you have, but it's a much more intentional, much more robust theology. I mean, you'll have a lot of people with very strong beliefs about, the interactions of other gods. And so that's basically the spectrum. Is it goes from right to left, how much you've decolonized after you deconstructed. But what's weird about it is Dorothy Soleil is a theologian who talked about 3 categories of mainstream Christianity. Like, I don't think she had any idea that there was going to be Christian witches down the road, but she said the three groups Christians always fall into are fundamentalist or orthodox, liberal, and radical. And her definitions that she used 20, 30 years ago match exactly what I found. But what was weird, I had not read that at that point in coming up with these. So it was like, I was talking to my advisor about this, and he was like, well, this is Dorothy Soleil, right? And I'm like, I don't. And he's like, go look at this chapter. We can go through it, but he's like, go read this chapter. And I was like, this is exactly what she described however many years ago. I was like, that's wild. And I had seen it in somewhere else, and I don't remember who. It was just a more recent church historian had also come up with Orthodox liberal. And he had kind of a more miscellany at the end, but radical too. So
it's almost like these things repeat themselves. Humans are a bit predictable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I see I don't know if these are Christian witches or whoever, but I've seen a lot of this on the internet. As like I said, I was very interested when I left Christianity and just seeing what was out there and exploring and reading and learning. And I've never considered myself a witch or anything like it, but I did spend a lot of time reading about different traditions and different practices and all of that. And I found it really interesting how there were so many very clear practices, there were so many practices that very clearly belong to a certain group of people. Mm-hmm. And I wish that I could say that I was surprised. I am never surprised anymore with white people. But they just decided like, oh, I like that. I'm going to do that too. When the reality is that practice is directly related to the ancestry of those people or the ancestry of that land. And it's not something that you can just go pick and choose from and take and have that be yours, right? It's not yours. It has nothing to do with you, and that's fine. And I'm thinking of one specifically because there was a woman who was very vocal about it, that like, who I am praying to, they are those that have passed in my lineage, right? That they're my sort of, this is my spiritual connection, my power. It's them. Go pray to your own. Like, right. Like that's yours. And if you don't like the lineage or ancestry you come from, you have to do work there. You can't just pop over here and say like, well, I want to practice that because like it's not yours. And it's a weird concept for folks. Like, I don't know why it's so weird. I mean, I do kind of, but like, why can't everything just belong to me? Right. And it's like, maybe you should sit your Western ass down for a second and think for a minute about like how this has gone in the past. Why can't that country belong to me? Why can't that country's resources belong to me? Why can't those people belong to me? Right. And we do the same thing so often now by just saying like, well, I like that. Who cares? I'm not going to do any real research or respect that like that isn't mine to take. I just like it and I think I have a right to it. And so I think it's a really interesting and unfortunate happening. I wish I could say it's unpredictable. But I just think it's important to note, and not to you because you know this, but to anybody that might be listening, that like, yeah, it actually is a problem to just run in and adopt other people's cultural practices. Hello?
I mean, it's not even, it's not also just a problem, but it's also a danger. So one of the things that in that LAA I talked about on the Adventist end, there's a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of you can't do this, you can't do that. On the liberation, then there's not so much of that, except when it comes to cultural appropriation. But some of that has to do with keeping people safe from stuff they don't understand. There was a person. They were contacting an African deity. I'm not going to say the name because I don't think I'm supposed to. But this African deity was a known trickster who maybe would call out to white people to say, hey, come follow me, and then mess them over really bad. And for not staying in their lane. And it was just kind of an acknowledged thing among that group that white people shouldn't be practicing this, not just because they're white, but because it's not safe for them to do. There were 2 people that died while I was writing this paper, both white people, while trying to attempt voodoo rituals. And they both died, and either during the ritual or right after. And these were recorded in like major national newspapers. And people are just like, see, this is why you don't do this. Yeah. Not the only reason you don't do it, but if nothing else stops you. So.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. And I know that there's going to be a lot of people listening that don't believe in any deities, and that's fine. You don't have to. But for the people that do in these cultures, they have knowledge of these beliefs, right? And you don't have to agree with them. You don't have to believe in them, but you should absolutely respect them.
Right.
And I do think, like, again, I'm not a super spiritual person, but I'm not going to fuck with somebody else's, like, some spiritual stuff, right? Like, I'm not going to mess around with voodoo or any of these things. Like, I don't know if they're real, and I'm not willing to chance it. And I think it's, again, like, there's just this weird belief, especially from Western folks, that other people don't know better than they do, right? So someone can be saying, like, don't do this, don't engage in this practice, because X, Y, and Z, and they still think, oh no, like, it'll be fine, I'll figure it out. And it's just like, what the arrogance of this mindset.
And a lot of these people, yeah. And a lot of these people, they're practicing something that was forbidden for hundreds of years because white people wouldn't let them practice it. And they had to very carefully practice these things in secret. And they've only been legal for 20, 30 years to practice their own religion. And as soon as it becomes legal, you have a bunch of people that formerly oppressed them wanting to practice it with them. I think that's another issue.
Yeah, something to certainly think about. And I know that as a pretty privileged white person in the old US of A, there is not a way for me to understand the sort of generational trauma that comes with having so much of your cultural identity, or just identity in general, stripped away, forbidden, and sort of stomped out. And then to have these same people, I mean, obviously, I'm not my grandfather, great-grandfather, but the same, I am a white person, right? I do have that in my past, to come in and say, like, well, I'm going to just do this too now because it sounds fun and interesting, and I can, without any acknowledgement of what was done to these people, their culture, their religions, their identities. Even if I acknowledge it, it still doesn't mean that there's space for me there. And there doesn't have to be. But yeah, it's odd to me. God, it's not even odd because, of course, but it's always disappointing to me how this colonial mindset truly never leaves. It's so ingrained in folks that they just think They don't think. It's so ingrained in folks that they think they have a right to everything. They think they know better than the people that are practicing, or the people that it belongs to. And they have absolutely no awareness of this trauma that exists in those communities, that they've done nothing but say like, nah, sorry, that sucks about, right? Anyway, I will digress. On that note, thank you so much for being here. This has been such a fantastic conversation I've been dying to have for so long. So I'm so excited I finally got to have it. I want to give you a chance to sort of plug anything, right? Where can we find you?
Sure.
Do you have anything coming out? Or if you don't want to be found, you can just say that too.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, and that's just Jeremy McNabb, JeremyMcNabb. It's probably going to be, my name will probably be in the notes of whatever you put up there, but it's just that at the @ with my name. I have an author page on Facebook because I spent about 10 years, 20 years trying to get published as a novelist. I had an agent and everything, but it never worked out. So that page is up there too, and I do occasionally post updates to that. I'm not involved with this project at all, but I want to plug this book. This is The Red Deal. It's a Native American indigenous action to save our Earth. And it has been absolutely life-changing for me to read. And it talks a lot about what those of us who aren't indigenous to the North American continent can do to be proper allies, both with regard to climate change and native sovereignty. So
That's awesome.
That has been a really, really impactful book for me to read. And I hope everyone else goes out and looks it up too. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for being here. I had a blast. If you ever want to come back and talk more about it, you know where to find me, because I would love to.
Absolutely.
But on that note, as I've said about 100 times, because that's apparently my favorite phrase, if you're watching, please like, subscribe, do all of the things. Go find Jeremy on Twitter. You will not regret it. And I will see y'all next time. Bye.
Bye.